For those of you who don't remember and your orientation was a big blur, we met during your orientation week, and we spent a little bit of time talking about the RATTLE program, which is Resident as Team Teacher, Learner, Educator, and Diagnostician. My name is Dr. Michael Giuliano. I'm a clinical neonatologist. I've been actually working as a neonatologist for 35, almost 40 years. I was the director of neonatology at Hackensack University Medical Center for about 15 years, but my entire career has really been spent in medical education. No matter where I was or what I was doing, I was always being a medical educator. And then about 7 years ago, I became a full-time associate dean at the School of Medicine for faculty, resident, and student development. And as I mentioned to everyone during the orientation, when I was offered the position by the dean to be the dean for faculty development, I actually turned it down unless it included the house staff, because residents are indeed the most important element of medical education, especially for our medical students, although I would actually argue you're absolutely critical, not just for the medical students, but also for your peers and, of course, for your faculty as well. And I think it's critically important that you recognize the centrality of your role as educators to your patients, to your students, to your peers, and to faculty. And I hopefully will make that point on multiple occasions today. So this afternoon, what we're really going to touch on is the front end of the RATTLE program, which is really all about you becoming lifelong learners, which is absolutely critical. You can't give what you don't know. So obviously you've got to address your own lifelong learning plans. And we're going to spend most of our time today really talking about what that means in terms of having a lifelong learning plan and what the potential elements are that we're going to put into that plan, not just preparing for your boards, but much more than that. Yeah, if you recall, when I presented the RATTLE program, I mentioned that it really has two parts. This is the front end, relatively passive side of it. Part one is focused on the interns across the whole network. And basically, we'll be doing a series of 3 workshops. This week, this is the 5th version of workshop number 1. We'll be doing 5 different dates the week of August 5th, and we'll be doing 5 different dates the week of August 21st. So there'll be 2 more webinars that hopefully everyone will be able to attend. But more importantly, after those are completed, we're going to basically be moving to part 2, which is local small group workshops within each of your departments. We've recruited RATTLE champions and frame champions, which is the faculty development part of this program. And we're hoping to actually have a set of workshops that we're going to do in each of your departments with all of the residents to really, instead of just talking about these principles, actually making them come alive, actually working with you to actually develop lifelong learning, really incorporate everything, including all your clinical learning, as well as all your preparations for everything else. And of course, also help with some of the educational principles and teaching principles we're going to talk about today as well. So just briefly, what we're going to cover today is your learning and your lifelong learning plan and how critical it is. I'm going to make some suggestions about what models you might want to consider using. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the underpinnings of organizing teaching and some of the skills that are really critical in teaching. In particular, we're going to talk about the entrustable professional activities, which are actually the behaviors that you're going to be judged on and indeed evaluated on, as well as the students, and how critical those entrustable professional activities are. So we've already sort of talked about what the objectives are for Learning 101. So we all have a fairly significant problem in that the half-life of, especially of clinical knowledge, is getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Some would argue that clinical guidelines and clinical practice is moving at the speed of light, and that everything's shifting within a year. Half of what you've learned is probably out of date already. That's a pretty daunting, a little bit worrisome fact if you really think about it. And obviously, you need to plan your learning and your own self-directed learning plan to take into account the fact that you're constantly moving the goalposts in terms of what the quality care is and what evidence has been accumulated and what the guidelines are. And that's a really daunting task. Obviously, underlying that daunting task is a lot of basic science. It also has to be learned and used, although luckily that material doesn't shift quite as fast as the clinical plans do. But you've got to create a system, ideally a system that's going to allow you to be able to incorporate all of your learning, both in the clinical setting, in conferences, in reading, in 100 different ways in which you're learning, searching, figuring out diagnostic dilemmas, looking up current therapies. All of this information that you're learning, you've got to keep track of. Otherwise, quite frankly, it's going to go in one ear, out the other. Or what usually happens to me is I think to myself, I learned this somewhere, but I can't remember where, and it's not really usable. And I think it's self-evident, at least I think it's self-evident to me, what really is critical to have a lifelong self-directed learning plan. We constantly want to keep up to date. We obviously need to do that in order to serve our patients, our students, our peers, and of course our faculty as well. And if you don't have a plan to do this and you're just doing it as things come at you, my guess is it's going to be relatively chaotic. And indeed, often things are going to fall through the cracks, and you're not going to have a systematic way of indeed recording, retaining that information for the long term. And that's actually what this is really all about, is having a plan, not just to pass your boards. I mean, obviously, you've got to have a plan to pass your boards. I'm sure your residency directors are all going to insist on you have a plan to pass your boards. And actually, you're going to create what's called an individual learning plan with your residency director. That's actually mandated. But I really want you to go far beyond that. I want you to start thinking about, how am I going to stay up to date, and how am I going to have a plan for the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, which is really, really critical. So what are the elements of this master plan? Well, actually, the first part, and I think probably one of the most important parts, is so obvious, it almost doesn't need to be said. But in my experience, especially residents, you're uncomfortable with your own ignorance. And I understand that. You know, you're taking on a new role as docs, you've got this new responsibility, and you feel like you should know it all. You, of course, know you don't, hopefully. And I think it's really critically important to come to recognize where your gaps are and get very comfortable with the 3 words, I don't know. I've worked with thousands of residents over my career, and I can count on relatively few hands how many residents, when in a situation where they're asked a question and they don't know, just spontaneously say, I don't know. Great question. Let's go figure it out. You know, you try to hide behind, statements like, well, it's an interesting question. Why don't you go find it out? Which is another way of saying, I don't know the answer. Or you change the subject. There's other ways to get around, sort of missing that you don't really know the answer to the question. Many house staff get very uncomfortable. I ask them, why don't you do more teaching? Why don't you consider yourself a teacher? They say, well, I don't know enough. And how could I be a teacher? And, I just don't know. And I actually tell them that's not a barrier to teaching. Actually, that's an incredible opportunity for indeed creating positive learning environment and modeling what we're most interested in, which is obviously answering those questions in a systematic way. So don't hide your lack of knowledge. I don't want you walking around saying, I don't know every 10 minutes, but be comfortable with your own ignorance, admit it, obviously prioritize big holes, and then go answer them. It's where basically where lifelong learning really begins, is an honest reflection about what your knowledge base is. Now, most people at this point in your career probably already don't have a set model of some kind or a structured model for lifelong learning. You might have an ILP, an individual learning plan, already starting to be put in place for you by your residency directors to make certain you're going to be okay in your in service exams and ultimately in your boards. But again, I really think it's important to have a plan that's much broader for the rest of your life. And I respectfully suggest you might consider getting the book, The Master Adaptive Learner. AMA published this a couple of years ago. It's relatively brief, but it really raises a whole host of questions about how we should go about creating a lifelong learning plan. And I think it really is very effective and simple. Their suggestion is to actually follow the pattern that we often do in quality improvement, which is a plan, do, study, act model. Well, in this particular case, they're suggesting that you should plan, learn, assess, and adjust. And one of the main focuses of this model is to deliberately, every single day, deliberately be looking for the major gaps or areas where you don't know. And then, of course, prioritize that list, because for me, it's still every day I get a big list. And then prioritize where you really want to go and indeed search out information to answer the question, learn it, and then, of course, apply it to your clinical practice so it sort of sticks. It's not rocket science, but it's a matter of being systematic and regular in doing it. I actually personally keep a 3x5 index card in my top pocket. That's my I don't know list, and I usually have a number of things on it almost every single day I take care of patients. And then I use that list to sort of drive my self-directed learning for that particular evening. It's important, I think, to have some mechanism for keeping track of your gaps and holes. And obviously prioritizing them is really important as well. What's most important, because you obviously can't learn everything every night, but learn one thing every night and prioritize what that is. The other thing I love about the Master Adaptive Learner is it reminds us all why we got here in the first place. None of you are on this call if you did not have a burning curiosity to learn, were incredibly motivated, had a growth mindset, and were incredibly resilient, because all of you, I'm sure, have been knocked down and you stood back up again. Those qualities have to be sustained. And indeed, residency is going to try to wear you down a little bit. You really have to hold on to these core qualities if you're going to have a successful lifelong.
Where's the volume?
Really,
This one?
somebody, a lot of background noise. Just unmute.
So I missed like logging in the beginning. So what do I do?
I'm not sure. Whoever just unmuted, if you could show kindness. No, I love this quote. This particular quote is a quote from a young Clara Mott, who actually won the contest to name the rover Curiosity. Thank you so much, Dr. Patel. This is a 12-year-old young lady who wrote this paragraph to win the contest to name the rover Curiosity. And I just love the way she put how powerful curiosity is for her in terms of driving her mind to learn. I keep this quote around my office, and every once in a while when I really get tired or a little burnt out, I just remind myself of how critically important that is. So I'm going to give you a couple of broad suggestions about what your ILP should look like. It's actually got to be individualized. You've got to create it for yourself within the abilities that you have, what your access is to a particular database, but it really is critical to have some mechanism to regularly identify your gaps. Obviously, you need a plan for what kind of evidence-based literature you're going to be using in order to answer the question about your clinical gaps or where you're going to turn for more basic science answers. Obviously, you've got to have a mechanism for keeping track of what you're learning in real-time journal reading, but I caution you, much of that reading, I think, is not very efficacious, since most of that material in the real-time journals aren't going to actually come to fruition. And you obviously need a way of utilizing systematic reviews of the literature in the areas you're interested in. And there are plenty of newsletters that are available in each of the subspecialty areas where someone is surveying the literature and indeed cherry picking the highest quality evidence-based reviews that they think you should really be seeing. It's a great way to amplify your coverage of the literature and to focus on evidence-based quality material and not waste your time on articles that will never come to fruition. I have a special note about understanding and learning about tests. Turns out that more and more we're using tests like black boxes, and there are more and more tests available. And indeed, it's incredibly common for us to misuse tests and not really understand them. So I really put an emphasis on our lifelong learning plans that whenever you run into a test that's new to you or that you've never really deeply tried to understand, spend the time to do that. It really is absolutely critical. And then I always encourage everyone to create for themselves a personal electronic and paper-based filing system that allows you to basically put the information into a system that will allow you to get it back whenever you need it, obviously using your phone probably as the interface. And the other part of any lifelong learning plan, I think, is to actively use what you learn to teach it to students, to peers, to faculty, because when you teach something, you really lock it in for long-term learning. And of course, you also will realize what you don't understand. Try to teach something, and the gaps that you have in your understanding will come out very, very quickly. The other part of a lifelong learning plan that I think is critically important is to really be thoughtful and reflective about the diagnostic reasoning process. So often we jump to conclusions in the diagnostic arena. We often don't really think through differentials extensively. Everyone needs to do that and indeed learn from that process. So keeping a record of diagnostic dilemmas and how you've worked through them is really critical. It should be part of what you put in. And lastly, but certainly not least, is as part of your own lifelong learning plan, you really need to find a coach or a mentor. Give it a little time, meet some people in your department. It can be a more senior resident. It could be a faculty member, either junior or senior, but you really want to find someone who can help you to sort of navigate this literal ocean of information that's being thrown at you, and how you can indeed parse it down into what's really critically important and prioritize it, and also help you to sort of create where you want to focus in terms of learning materials. And obviously, if you've got other interests in terms of research, et cetera, they certainly will help there as well. But just from a learning perspective, it really is important to have a senior or a more senior coach or mentor. I really want to emphasize that obviously as part of your lifelong learning plan, clearly you all probably already have subscriptions to a bunch of journals. The subscription to I shouldn't say just, but your subscription to sort of real-time monthly journals or weekly journals is probably where a lot of people spend their time, quote unquote, sort of learning for life. The reality is the majority of those articles will never impact your clinical care. So I just caution people in terms of how much time you have and how much you use to do general science reading from modern, from real-time journals versus reading that is problem focused on patients you're caring for, other problems you're dealing with, and using quality evidence-based material, whether that's a well-done PubMed search. The Cochrane database is my own personal favorite systematic review database. I think it's the gold standard for doing reviews of clinical questions. I have a strong bias, as does the School for Dynamed Plus, because I think it is a better evidence-based resource than UpToDate, which is very popular, but not quite the same degree of quality. Actually, Google Scholar and now some of the AI programs are getting quite good at doing searches and helping you to find literature. I still caution you, a lot of the AI programs are still a little bit too immature. They still confabulate a bit. I'm not sure we can use them by themselves. I've been playing with them more and more, but I always compare them to the outcomes from a Cochrane review or some other more gold standard process. And I would also suggest that at least become a little bit familiar with the finding information framework, which we use at the School of Medicine and teach to our students. Is readily available on the medical school website. You just need to go to the library website and the finding information framework will come up. And the basic idea behind this is that almost all of our questions can be indeed sort of dissected into background questions around basic science, molecular biology, pathophysiology, whatever the basic science that underlies whatever the issue is, versus foreground questions, which really are basically clinical questions. Where you go to answer those questions is vastly different. We make suggestions about where to go in terms of core texts for background questions. And of course, we make suggestions about foreground questions related to clinical care. And I've already mentioned some of the quality evidence-based resources that I think people should be relying on to indeed look into the literature. I've already mentioned this once, but I can't emphasize enough. As part of your self-directed learning plan, understand your tests and tools that you use. When you're using a test, whatever it is, no matter how simple or frequent, learn everything about it in the context that you're using it. I just was actually at the Quest lab. We do a field trip with our students into the Quest laboratory, and I asked the students a number of questions about CBCs. You know, they're about a year into med school, and they all already have a pretty clear understanding of using CBCs in clinical care, yet almost none of them had an understanding of using it in context. Like, for example, the norms for a CBC are completely different by age and by setting. So you really have to understand the reliability and validity of the test in the context you're using. And of course, positive and negative predictive values will shift depending on the incidence and prevalence of the disease you're looking at in a given population. And you got to know that as you apply a test to it. So spend a little bit of energy and time in your individual learning plan to really get to know tests. I actually have files on the tests and the context in which we use them. So I think that's a critical part of your self-directed learning plan. Partly why it's such a pet peeve for me is that more and more it looks like misinterpretation of laboratory and diagnostic tests has crept in as a major cause of diagnostic error, which is going to be a subject of one of our workshops as we move forward. So all this learning you're doing every day, taking notes on rounds, conferences, etc. You're doing searches, you're looking for evidence-based material, you're doing real-time reading, you're looking up the most recent test that you just played with, and you're doing that every single day. And if you have it on paper, it sort of piles up in a big hurry. I used to do it all by paper before we had electronic databases, and your office will look like this or the equivalent of this in a Google spreadsheet or whatever it is you're using to put things together. You really need an organized system, an organized personal filing system in order to keep this all straight. And how you organize it is how you think. So I don't usually propose a specific index for a personal filing system. I think you need to create that or use one that naturally aligns with how your brain works. I actually personally created it and expanded it over time, but it really is critical that you have a mechanism for keeping track of all of this material, including case material. Obviously, if you're keeping patient case material as a tool for remembering what you've learned, you're going to need to be careful about HIPAA and make certain that it's protected in some way. So you might want to keep that on paper in a locked file cabinet. But you really need to have a mechanism for creating a database that has an indexing system that allows you very easily to drop articles and or conference notes and or clinical work into the system quickly. Obviously, expense is not really the issue anymore. Almost all the databases are either free or very cheap. And the real test of the data set is if you've dumped information in, can you retrieve it easily and find it? You know, what are the hooks that you've connected to that information that allows you to retrieve it easily, either by disease or by problem base or by laboratory? There's a whole bunch of different ways of doing it. You probably want to use all of the above. The other thing is that it's got to be very flexible so that you can continually add subject areas and or sub-subject areas, and it needs to be weedable since, as I've mentioned already, half of what you're learning right now is going to be wrong in a year or two. So it really has to have all these qualities, and it really has to be personal. I discourage people from, so grabbing a preset index, because that's probably not the way you think. So really critically important that you create this yourself. And actually, real quickly, in summary, I think you heard all these points, but just real quickly, I mean, I think it's real critical that you have a plan for the rest of your life. Real critical that you're comfortable with your own ignorance and be comfortable with I don't know. I really think it's important to really think about thinking when you approach clinical problems. I think I've beaten you up enough about the labs, and hopefully that will be a habit you develop. Obviously, reading the general literature, you got to be doing it, but try to skew towards evidence-based quality material and don't waste your time with a lot of the other stuff. Obviously, it really is critical that you really go after the best available data and you start utilizing Dynamed Plus or the Cochrane database or some other quality evidence-based proctored data set, so you're not wasting your time in poor quality articles. And again, I use people around me to help teach me. I actually use the medical students all the time because I think the medical students have a knowledge base, especially a basic science knowledge base that augments mine, especially around genetics in particular. But you want to use students and consultants and your peers and your faculty as your educator. And in particular, when a consultant comes and shows up, I don't let him get out of the room without giving me a good, solid, evidence-based, broad review on whatever the problem or subject is that I called them for in the first place. And again, don't shy away from taking notes on rounds and in conferences, whether it's on a smart board or some kind of electronic board or written. I still have a pen in my hand all the time and take notes. It's a great way to remember, and you just have to make sure that you're able to put that learning and those notes into your system, whether it's manual on paper or whether it's electronic. So it's really critical to do that. And of course, gather the information you're learning every day and get it into the system. And of course, I've already emphasized you need to teach. So a little bit of homework. We are going to come to your department at some point in the fall, and one of the first workshops is really around this issue of your own individual learning plan and your lifelong self-directed learning plan. So I really encourage all of you to, especially thinking about it right now, give some thought to what the elements should be in your personal library, what the elements should be in terms of your own personal plan. How much time are you going to be devoting pretty much every day to some deeper dive of self-directed learning, and how you're going to organize all this. And we'd love to see and talk about the answers that you have to those questions when we get together. Also, look for diagnostic errors along the way, because that will be a workshop well into the future, but just wanted to give you a heads up to really do that. What you're really doing is you're building a bridge that's never going to be finished. And it's a bridge I think of as really a knowledge bridge into the future. It's never going to be finished. I'm still building my bridge, 40 years, 45 years later. It really is critical to realize that this is a lifelong process. And hopefully the sooner you start structuring it and having a plan, I think the more successful you're going to be. So you've been listening to me for almost a half an hour. I'm going to stop for a second. And I'd really love to hear from all of you in terms of what you've heard in the past half an hour that really struck you as really important and meaningful, where you're actually saying to yourself, wow, I really want to make certain that I incorporate that into my life plan in terms of learning. And what did you find sort of muddy or sort of crazy? Where you're thinking to yourself, he's out of his mind. There's no way I'm going to be able to incorporate that into my life. And I'll open that up to everyone. There's almost 60 of you on here. Looks like there's also rooms that have a number of other people in it. I'll leave it open for spontaneous answer, and I'll give you a little while to think, and then I'll just start asking people randomly. All right. Well, those are excellent points. I appreciate you all in terms of your specific input. Let's go back real quick and let's just change gears slightly. Um, in the last few minutes that we have together, I do just want to briefly touch on some of the core elements of teaching. I purposely don't want to spend a lot of time talking about educational theory. What I really do want to talk about, though, is a little bit about the core tools that I think are critical to be an educator, especially communication skills, which we can only talk about, not really demonstrate, and of course, the use of questions. We have a organizational principle called the 1-minute learner, which we will spend almost an entire workshop on in August. But I think everybody should have some idea how to get things organized, and I can give you the freeze-dried version of organizing things today. And actually, I'm going to do that really quickly. But in the few minutes we have left, I'm really just going to touch on the competencies, the 8 core competencies that actually structure your entire educational field. The competencies came out of graduate medical education and have worked their way down into undergraduate medical education. So these are actually more germane for you than the students. But more importantly is the entrustable professional activities, which are the behaviors we do, the units of work we do every day in taking care of patients, and will be the skills and the abilities that we will judge you as well as the students on in terms of how you progress in your residency. If you haven't heard already about your milestones and how you'll be judged on those milestones, they are all based on the entrustable professional activities. So these issues are really quite germane, to be honest, to all of you, not just to the medical students. So the North Star of educational process are learning objectives. You'll notice everywhere I've started every single section of this talk with learning objectives. What do we want to learn? And I actually, ideally, those learning objectives should be SMART. That is, they're specific, they're measurable, you can get it done, achievable in the time frame you're looking at, and they're realistic and relevant. And ideally, you want to know what those SMART learning objectives are when you're interacting with a student on clerkship or in an elective or whatever environment you're sitting in. So, when you meet up with a student, and this is the freeze-dried organizational process that I would suggest, sort of, talk with them and have a broad idea of who they are, where they are, what their long-term goals are. But most importantly is ask them where their needs are. What have they already accomplished? What have they done already in their pediatric rotation or surgical rotation? And what are the specific objectives that they're looking to accomplish today? Because you really want to address those. Our natural tendency is to give the students the hardest patient, the most complex patient, the rarest patient, but you really want to have patient selection, which drives the methodology of our teaching, really focused on what the learning objectives are for that student that day. And it really is important to know that. Obviously, our methodology is usually patient selection and case care. We don't usually use many other methodologies, although we can talk about that later. And of course, you need to evaluate and you need to give feedback, which we'll do whole workshops on in the latter part of August. So it really is important, I think, more than anything else, for you to understand that your education is constructed across these 8 core competencies. And this is a visual concept map that sort of organizes the 8 core competencies. Instead of listing them, this is how they really interact with each other. I think it's really important that you know these, because this is how you're going to be judged. But we also judge our students on this, and the underlying medical school core competencies are exactly the same as the ones that judge you. And for those of you who see these core competencies, they're just too big. They're big, broad goals. They're very important, but they're not SMART. What is SMART are the entrustable professional activities. These are fairly specific units of work that we can easily observe, measure, sort of make a judgment about how long it takes to teach, and indeed are the things you will be evaluated on and students will be evaluated on. Actually, when we talk about the evaluation tool in a later workshop, you're going to see it's the evidence, it's the entrustable professional activities. When we talk about the learning objectives of a particular clerkship, when we meet you in part 2 of RATTLED and show you the learning objectives of a given of a given department, you're going to see the entrustable professional activities embedded in there. So what are they? So if I all sat around a table and said, what do you do every day? This is the list that you'd come up with. You do a history, you do a physical, generate a differential, order tests, interpret tests, solve the clinical problem that you're trying to do, obviously write a documentation, oral presentation, go chase the literature for the part you don't understand, give handovers, work with other members of the interprofessional team, recognize who's sick and who's not sick, get consents, do procedures, and try to make the system better with quality improvement. And these are the original 18 double AMC EPAs that came out about 25 years ago. The School of Medicine felt like we really missed a few in the original ones, and we've added EPA 14, which is around communication skills, counseling and education of patients is so critical. Again, education is an integral part. Developing chronic care plans. Most of the original EPAs were really focused on acute care. We really wanted to focus also on long-term chronic care. Obviously, professionalism and growth is about self-directed learning, duh. And of course, last but not least is the determinants of health, which somehow got left out in the original ones, but now has become so absolutely critical in what we do in medicine. So now you have a little bit of an understanding of broad organization, about our competency-based education, and about entrustable professional activities. In the last few minutes, I just want to talk about the skill set that is really required for qualified teachers and educators. Using and applying questions in a more sophisticated way is incredibly important. It's the oldest tool in the book, but it's probably also the most misused tool in the book. And there are specific communication styles and indeed techniques that I think are critical to creating positive learning environments, and indeed creating an environment where you really effectively convey information or help information to be created. You know, questions have been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's the oldest teaching tool in the book, but regrettably, it's also probably the most misused teaching tool in the book. Often questions are lower order, simple, closed, and factual based, and not really more sophisticated, deeper, with trying to drive to deeper learning. And often they're used as bludgeons instead of tools for teaching. And I would actually argue, when you're going to go to teach students and or peers or faculty, you really want to think deeply about the questions you're going to ask in whatever session you're doing. And they should be disciplined and not just spontaneous off the top of your head. As a rule, those generally tend to be more superficial. You know, again, trying to get at descriptions, connections, and explanations. And of course, it should be a question that really leads to other topics and an open conversation. I think it really is important that questions drive deeper thinking and problem solving, which is really what questions really should be all about. You know, you of course learned about open-ended questions versus closed-ended questions in interviewing, but just like in interviewing, open-ended questions far more useful, far more effective in terms of getting information than just factual-based closed-end questions. When we do meet in part 2, we actually will spend a little bit of time talking about how to organize questions according to Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy talks about questions at 6 different levels. The first 2 levels are basic knowledge and comprehension, which is where 80% of most questions are if you're untrained. But what we really want to try to drive everyone to is asking the application question, using knowledge in a new and novel way, and indeed being able to use it, not just recall it, which is really critical. And also higher order questions are really asking people to analyze what's going on with this patient in congestive heart failure, or being able to put together, synthesize what potentially is the cause of this patient's abdominal pain. And so analysis and synthesis is really all about, you know, patient care and expanding those kind of questions. And then, of course, level 6 are making judgments in uncertainty. And that's really where we spend our entire lives doing that, and why this stays real interesting and medicine never gets boring, because we're always working to some degree making judgments in uncertainty. And driving students to that level of question is not easy, but also incredibly important. This is not the venue to be able to talk about using communication behaviors of a teacher. But again, there are certain teaching behaviors that we really want to demonstrate when we see you live. And again, the use of silence, waiting, appropriate time to wait after you've asked a question is somewhere between 5 and 8 seconds. Obviously, eye contact, but in this environment, all your screens are black again. Self-disclosure, actually, I've utilized that several times already. Obviously, open-ended encouragement is always critical. There's a whole host of things here. Critiquing, correcting, persuasion, using questions, giving feedback are all critical communication skills used by teachers, all with the goal of really creating an environment where everybody is engaged, everyone is involved, everyone's comfortable to ask questions, even when they're not certain, and that indeed we've created a safe, inclusive environment where everybody's where everyone is respected. And actually, fundamentally, that's really one of our primary jobs, is indeed to have engagement of everyone, have respectful environments, everyone feels safe, and that everyone's learning. We don't want people intimidated or abused, and we certainly don't want people sleeping because they're bored and they're not being involved. And we want to find that dynamic tension of a positive learning environment, which if you've been in, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And it's really your role to help create that kind of environment. Well, in a very short period of time, we've actually sort of walked through a lot of ideas. I mean, obviously in Learning 101, we've really focused on your self-directed learning plan, your own individual learning plan for the next 5, 10, 20, and 40 years. And when we see each other in workshops, we'll certainly start talking about that. Go play with the Master Adaptive Learner book. I think you really will enjoy it and will help you to guide you in the creation of individual learning plan. Obviously, I've given you some ideas about what the elements should be. And then, of course, in Teaching 101, we've yet again reviewed competency-based education, but more importantly, talked about how critical it is for you to know those SMART learning objectives for your student today. When you go back into the clinical arena this afternoon, you have a medical student, ask them what their learning objectives are for today. And of course, the most important thing we talked about from the construct of teaching is the entrustable professional activities, those 18 behaviors that you're being judged on, and indeed students are being judged on. It will be critical to know those as we move forward in other workshops. And of course, the basic skills we just talked about, which are really difficult to demonstrate in this setting, but we will obviously have the opportunity to do that when we're in smaller groups. I just want to make sure everybody has clicked in either to the link or the QR code and have recorded their individual attendance, because it is mandated. So hopefully everyone's already done that. Also, I want to make certain that you mark your calendars. The second and third parts of the Rattle Part 1 series will be the week of August 5th for Teaching 102 and Eval 101, and the week of August 19th for Eval 102 and Thinking 101. And hopefully you'll mark your calendars and we'll see you there fairly shortly. And as I've said before, Part 2 is where these ideas come off of the paper and actually become alive. And hopefully you'll be able to start utilizing them and actually working with them directly. So I purposely left the last few minutes to ask the same question I asked earlier. What in the course of the past hour have you found most meaningful? And what have you found still to be muddy or something that you really think is not doable? And I'm going to stop sharing again and go to gallery view. And again, I'm going to ask everyone spontaneously to sort of reflect on that and answer. Just unmute and tell me. Otherwise, I'll do what I did last time, is just pick a few people. What did you find most meaningful? What did you find muddy? How to find the time, right?
Yep.
Too much part of your responsibility. Actually, a little note, everyone is now part of the School of Medicine. The residents are all now medical associates in the School of Medicine and actually have an appointment. So make certain you take advantage of that. And by the way, just for the record, I'm in week 2,340, and I still am grappling with the same sets of issues in terms of finding the time to both learn and teach. Obviously in a very different place now because my job is more and more teaching, but again, it's never an easy balance. But I think the important part is to have a plan to try to do that. It is after 1 o'clock. I'm sure you all need to run to take care of your patients. I enjoyed interacting with everyone. I'm glad we had an opportunity to talk for a little while. Looking forward to seeing you the week of August 7th and August 21st, and more importantly, interested in seeing you in the part 2, where we come to your local institutions and your local departments with a number of members of our staff, and indeed work with you directly in small groups. Best of luck, and put that plan together. Hopefully to talk to you soon. Thank you all for joining us. Take care. Bye-bye now.